Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, there we go. Thank you. I don't have to shout so much. I'm Patty Muldoon with the League of Women Voters of Arlington. Yay! That was for the League. And I'm very excited to welcome you all here on behalf of the organizations that have pulled this together for you tonight. So that it's the League of Women Voters of Arlington and Cantalina and Arlington Friends of the Drama. So we are the lead organizations, but we have also included Voices Rising, another women's chorus, and ACMi, Arlington Community Media. So we're very excited that our months of collaborations are finally bearing fruition with tonight's event. So I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First, I want to mention that we are welcoming not only the folks who are physically in the room, in the theater tonight, but also welcoming those who are watching live stream. It is on ACMi.tv on the public channel, 3 channels. So it's on the public channel, and it also will be recorded. So I want you all to know that tonight's performance is recorded courtesy of Arlington Community Media. So photography and audio recordings and video recordings may be used for promotional and educational purposes. And if you are inspired to take a picture, no flash, please. So we are very excited for this collaborative effort, and on behalf of those who don't have programs, those who are watching at home, I will just go over the flow of the evening. We are going to start with this wonderful documentary film, How Long Must We Wait? Then those of us here will have an intermission, and you'll get some water, and you'll get access to the restrooms. So we have an accessible restroom here and a couple more down in the lobby. For those of you at home, you're on your own for that. And another piece I am to tell you is to please silence or turn off your phones. That would help a lot, particularly with the recording, which is less forgiving. So exits are there, oops, and over there. Hopefully we won't need them until the end of the evening. After we have our film and the intermission, then comes the live part of the evening, where we see if it's possible to fit this many people on one stage. And after the rousing libretto that we are about to see and hear, with readers and instrumentalists and many singers, then we will have an audience talk back. So I am told in the theater world that is a known thing. I will tell you that it is not a Q&A. I do not have the answers. But I will give you a wonderful query or question to think about. So think about what's going on with you. We will have mic runners to invite those in the theater to share in the talk back. And then we're having a reception with food from like cookie time. Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that part. I had to buy one because I couldn't dive into the donations, so that was very cool. Speaking of donations, this actually cost a few $1,000s plus to bring to you, despite the fact that almost all of us are volunteers. So we would be most grateful if you would contribute. There will be an opportunity at intermission and end of the evening. There's an opportunity to use Venmo, so you can, if you have the program, the QR code. We would love donations of $10 or more. And if we have more than meets the needs of just tonight, we'd like to contribute the rest to ACMi, whose funding has been seriously cut, and we need our local journalists, don't we? So we have to support them. And I thought I would just tell you about the colors of the sash. So gold is the light, the torch that guides our purpose, and white is for purity and moral quality of our purpose, and violet is loyalty and steadfastness to a cause. So I just thought I'd answer that question before anybody asks. Those are the colors, but there have been Oh, give women the vote. GWV, give women the vote. Thank you, Elizabeth. We started with a meeting of 4, and now it's up to like 17 people just in the planning. So it's been many of us bringing this together for you tonight, and I'm so excited. So thank you for being with us, and we will get to enjoy the documentary now.
It took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. At least 1,000 legal enactments were necessary, and every one was a struggle against ignorant opposition. Women's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
Well, the women's suffrage movement, I would say, technically began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention that was held in Seneca Falls, New York.
The result of that convention was a Declaration of Sentiments, which was based on the Declaration of Independence, but it talked about, things that women wanted to have happen in their lives. If they were married, they were considered civilly dead. They had no rights. If they had property when they got married, their husband got the property. If they worked, their husband got the paycheck.
And one of the things that they asked for in a formal way for the first time was the right to vote for women, which at the time was thought to be absolutely outlandish and, downright crazy. I mean, this was sort of grounds for dismissing the whole idea of what the convention was about, because this was so out of mainstream thought. But that's where it began.
To understand the culture at the time, it will come as no surprise that the widespread belief was that a woman's place was in the home, taking care of her husband, her children, the house, family matters. And the men went out into the world. And it was thought at that time that politics was not a suitable venue for women, those smoke-filled rooms, and it was no place for a woman. A woman's place was in the home, period.
And then there was a lot of education, organizing, breaking the ground for people to understand why women needed to participate in the vote. And that was during the 19th century. And by the 20th century, you had only 4 Western states that had granted voting rights to women.
Had been the approach almost since the beginning of the suffrage movement. They would go state by state, have an election, and move on in that way, but not take on the Federal Amendment. The Federal Amendment was not new. It had been first proposed in 1887, voted on by the Senate, failed, of course, by a large margin. Sometimes called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because Anthony campaigned for it and believed in it.
By the turn of the century, the original founding mothers were dead. The federal amendment had not been pushed in years. And the next generation of leaders were very smart, very effective women. But Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been, fire-breathing dragons. And the new leadership just really didn't measure up to the charisma of women like those.
Well, there were a number of divisions along the way. Women are not necessarily all thinking in the same way. And so there were different blocs. And the suffrage movement had gone on so long that a kind of an establishment had taken over. And Alice Paul threatened that establishment.
Her background was as a Quaker, raised in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Her first real exposure to suffrage politics came in England in the year 1909. She was in England studying when she became aware of the suffrage movement, and specifically the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the militant arm of the British suffrage movement and founded by Emmeline Pankhurst.
The Pankhursts were throwing bricks through windows, they were smacking policemen in the face, they were setting bombs on fire, they were militant in a way that the American movement never was.
But it was here that she learned suffrage politics and tactics that she would bring back with her to the United States.
And Alice Paul sort of was enthralled and little by little rose up through the ranks because Emmeline Pankhurst realized that she would say yes. And she was arrested one day along with a whole big group of women, and they were taken to a police station. And Alice Paul was sitting on a billiards table in the police station and noticed another woman with an American flag lapel pin, and introduced herself as a fellow American, and that was Lucy Burns. And Lucy Burns was also in Europe for graduate school, had also sort of come under the thrall of the Pankhurst movement, and they sat there on the billiard table chatting, bemoaning at the lackluster nature of the American suffrage movement and sort of plotting how they would enliven it when they moved back home. And so the first thing they did was plan a march down the streets of Washington, right down Pennsylvania Avenue, from the Capitol to the White House through the middle of federal Washington, to coincide with the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. So it was planned for March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration.
And that was a huge demonstration that was planned to show Wilson that American women actually wanted the vote, and that there should be a national amendment enfranchising women. In other words, don't spend all your time and your energy going state by state by state. You're never going to get it that way. Do it as a national amendment to the Constitution.
The 1913 March on Washington was the first March on Washington. It was the first civil rights march. It was the first march on Pennsylvania Avenue. There have been parades on Pennsylvania Avenue, celebratory parades. But this idea of taking a political issue to federal Washington and demanding something of the people who made laws there in the nation's capital, that had never been done before. Now it's so routine, we just think of it as a traffic headache, but it was Alice Paul's idea.
She managed to get somewhere close to, 8,000 marchers. That particular march turned into a real melee. There were about 500,000 men that had come to Washington for this inauguration, and they'd been drinking, and they got a little rowdy, and they started calling these women names. They pressed in on them and pushed them so that they were marching single file. They started ripping their clothes off.
And they tripped the women and spit on them and yelled names at them, and the police did nothing to stop them. In many cases, the police joined in the spitting and the tripping and the name calling.
The headlines the day after the march was not about the pageantry of the parade. It was about how it had dissolved into violence and how 100 women had been taken to area hospitals, and how Helen Keller was so disoriented she wasn't able to speak at Constitution Hall. Alice Paul recognized that when Americans across the country read these headlines, they would feel sympathy for the women.
And ultimately, Alice Paul, because she was so media savvy, realized that this kind of near riot of the parade was the best thing that ever could have happened, that it would keep the suffrage movement in the news for much longer than a perfect parade ever would have.
I always felt that Alice Paul was brilliant at marketing the suffrage movement, and she did win over the country, and she understood the role of public opinion.
So when Lucy Burns and Alice Paul decided to start with this parade in 1913 and do something that was a little bit more in your face, a little bit more attention getting, even a little bit more guerrilla, it was shocking. And the National American Women's Suffrage Association was pretty hesitant about it. They liked the idea in theory, but they knew that Burns and Paul were Emmeline Pankhurst acolytes, and they knew that this might be the thin end of the wedge for more aggressive tactics, and that made them very, very nervous.
The differences in style and leadership and tactics caused Alice Paul to break with the mainstream group, which was called the NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and to form the National Woman's Party. And she wanted to form a political party of all women so that they could use their clout to lobby for things that were necessary to pass the amendment.
Alice and Lucy thought that it would be easier and quicker to get approval for a federal amendment from the National Congress because you were only dealing with one body, and that was their reasoning, and that was their strategy.
The suffrage movement was attracting a number of very prominent women at this point. Suffrage had gone from being this sort of kooky idea that a few women had to a real national movement that encompassed about 7 million organized women. And these women were organized to the teeth. You know, no phones, no Twitter, no texting, no email, and yet they managed to organize these 7 million women into this powerful lobbying machine to get women the right to vote.
The opposition to the suffrage movement, and whether on a state level or a federal level, was very strong and fairly well organized. There were anti-suffrage organizations in many states.
The public condemnation of suffragists went through a few evolutions. In the 19th century, the editorial cartoons, for instance, always characterized suffragists as these hook-nosed crones, these humorless, terrifying old ladies in high-necked blouses who were scolds and often had some kind of an umbrella or cane that they looked like they were about to beat you over the head with. And they were characterized as nasty women who couldn't get a husband and who were forced to go out and be suffragists because they had no life. And then as the movement progressed and broadened, there was this whole trope of the abandoned man. So there was cartoon after cartoon that was some variation on some poor, helpless man covered in diapers and babies and laundry while his unthinking wife puts on a sash and marches out the door to vote. And then there were sort of a counter push because the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association was very aware of public image. The National Women's Party had a full-time artist, Nina Allender, and she created a character, the Allender Girl, who was this lovely, young, stylish woman. And all of the cartoons that went on the cover of the Suffragist, the National Women's Party newsletter, showed this dashing Allender girl off doing important things for the movement. And so there was this kind of counter image of being a suffragist being stylish. It's being something trendy, being something that young, progressive, right-minded women did.
There were a couple that people found really offensive, the way she caricatured Wilson.
"1916 was not a great year for the suffrage movement. Woodrow Wilson was reelected in a landslide. He absolutely stood in the way of suffrage on a national level. And so by the end of 1916, the movement was pretty discouraged. There had been some progress between 1910 and 1916. A few states had added suffrage. There were a bunch of states that had suffrage on the ballot in 1916, and they all voted it down. There was some momentum for a federal amendment, but then this president who opposed the federal amendment is reelected and no state passes it. And then at the very end of 1916, a woman named Inez Milholland, who had been one of the great shining stars of the National Women's Party. That's her in the white dress on the white horse leading the parade in 1913, looking like Wonder Woman with a star on her forehead. She was one of their best public speakers. And she collapsed on stage giving a pro-suffrage speech at the end of 1916, and she died in the hospital a few weeks later. She never recovered. And her sister, who was in the audience, said her final words were, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" So Inez Milholland, this beautiful, brilliant, great future, dies literally giving a speech for the cause. So she's an instant martyr.
Alice Paul was devastated, as was the entire National Women's Party, at losing this vibrant, brilliant woman.
The National Women's Party was incredibly discouraged. The election had gone badly. The momentum seemed to be stopping. They had this roadblock in the White House, and now Inez Milholland is dead. So at the beginning of 1917, they think, we've got to do something new. It's enough with the marches and the petition drives and all the things we've been doing. It's time to really shake things up.
The women had sent a number of delegations to the White House to talk to Woodrow Wilson about women voting rights. And they were going to talk to Woodrow Wilson in another delegation of women to go see him yet again. And finally he said, no more delegations. I don't want to talk to any more women about the woman's right to vote.
And so Alice Paul thought back to her days in England when she had been a suffragette and decided that, it was time that they needed to do more.
So, frustrated that they couldn't get to the chief executive, they decided to get as close as they could, and they began, putting their signs and their banners right in front of the White House. Take it right to the president.
The idea of standing in front of the White House and demanding something was unprecedented and shocking. The plan was to stand in front of the White House every day throughout January and February of 1917. And the visuals were all very planned out. Women in dark coats with the sash across it, black and white photography. You knew exactly how those contrasts were going to work. The big White House behind them, holding these very prominent banners that were light-colored with an easy-to-read font. All of this was thought through. The banners said things like,
Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And they just stood there. They called themselves silent sentinels. So they weren't speaking, they weren't marching. They became something of a tourist attraction.
there are stories of women coming and joining the picket lines on their honeymoons. It was sort of a thing to do.
They were thought to be objects of curiosity. So they did not have what you would call a lot of support from the get-go for the picketing. The press was pretty well lined up in opposition because this did not seem to be the sort of thing that these women would do.
And so this was a radical departure from anything they'd ever done in their life. And so the assumption in the White House by President Wilson and others is that as soon as it got cold or too hot, they would disappear, but nothing dissuaded them. They just kept coming back.
And they would stand in front of the White House from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. They didn't picket on Sunday. These women were out there in every kind of weather that you can imagine. They were freezing cold. They were soaking wet.
When you see pictures, I always look at their feet because they don't have on nice warm boots. They have on these little thin-soled leather shoes.
They had to rotate women through. Women would come from headquarters with hot bricks for the women to stand on. There are stories of there being one fur coat among them that they passed around on particularly cold days.
And of course, Wilson took them very lightly. It was very cold out there, January. So Wilson invites them to come in for hot chocolate, and they think better of that. This is really not how we want to be treated by the person that we're challenging. So it was a scramble to keep that picket line going, and Alice and Lucy established state days where they tried to bring in delegations from New Jersey or New York or Pennsylvania. College days designed to recruit college students, nurses' days, teachers' days, whatever they could think of to drum up support for the picketing. That was sort of the motif, January into February into March. The war, of course, had started in Europe, and Wilson was under increasing pressure to send troops to Europe to enter that war. There were provocative actions by the Germans that he could no longer ignore. The pressure grew. And so by that spring, Wilson appears before Congress, gives a speech, calls for a declaration of war. And in this speech he gives the pickets a great gift. He speaks of joining into a war, making the world safe for democracy.
Woodrow Wilson was on the world stage giving a speech a minute about how important democracy was. That was the theme of America's involvement in World War I. And the bold hypocrisy of him being the poster child for democracy all over the world while he was the single biggest roadblock to the enfranchisement of half of his own population was just something they couldn't stand. The National Women's Party couldn't let that go.
And back at Suffrage headquarters, they think this one over, and they begin to use Wilson's words against him. And you begin to see signs like,
Don't believe the president when he says we have democracy in the United States. He's fighting for democracy abroad, but he won't let half the population have democracy at home. So they really stuck it to him on the dichotomy between what he was doing, making the world safe for democracy, and denying democracy to women at home. Very powerful stuff.
They kept up the pickets throughout the summer of 1917. And not only did they keep it up, they got a lot more critical of the president.
When German envoys came and Russian envoys came, the women were very pointed in their banners, even one calling Wilson Kaiser Wilson.
There was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the country at that time, and so to be called Kaiser, that did not please Wilson. And he resented the women for distracting America and him, from what the focus should be.
These women became a thorn in his side.
And public tide really did turn against them. They were not just criticizing the president in wartime, they were criticizing him very pointedly, very publicly.
This was sort of looked at as a personal indignity to the president. And the women who had sort of amused public crowds when their picketing started, now that the war was on, were seen as probably traitorous because they were challenging the president and his policies for the country.
People started protesting the protests.
the women are attacked. They're attacked by mobs. Some of them are injured.
They started tearing the banners out of the women's hands.
Their banners are ripped from the poles. They're hurled to the ground.
The police didn't do anything to stop that.
There is taking place now in front of the White House, almost on a daily basis, a riot. And many of these crowds were government workers, and many were uniformed servicemen who were extraordinarily angry at the pickets and thought they were treasonous.
And the whole idea of the government was to shut this down. Particularly, it was embarrassing Woodrow Wilson during wartime.
Finally, Woodrow Wilson told the police to start arresting them, figure out some way to get them off my sidewalk. I've had enough.
So the first arrests take place in June of 1917. Well, what are the women going to be charged with? This is kind of a problem.
And they kind of made something up. They told the women they were being arrested for obstructing the traffic on the sidewalk.
Well, you can't really obstruct traffic when you're standing against a fence on a sidewalk, but that's what happened.
This is a misdemeanor in Washington, and you have to imagine the sidewalk in front of the White House is very wide. The women are standing there, and they're not taking up very much space. They're obstructing traffic. And they decide to charge the women, incidentally, not the people who were attacking them.
They weren't actually committing any crimes. So it was the progressive era. There was a lot of labor unrest. Picketing was specifically legal. There was nothing they were doing that broke any law. They were brought before the judge, and in one of many, many instances of the men in this story underestimating the women in this story, the judge said, all right, $5 fine or 1 night in jail. Assuming that all the women would say, oh no, I can't possibly go to jail. Here's my $5. I'll never do it again. And every single one of them said, bring it. I'll go to jail. There's 30 more women who'll pick up the pickets tomorrow. Try me.
And Wilson actually pardons them the first time, and they are released.
And so the next day, there's women picketing again, and they're all hauled before the judge, and the judge says $5 fine or 3 nights in jail. And they all say, fine, 3 nights in jail. I have no problem with that. I'll go today.
And they go right back out on the picket line. Well, over the course of that summer, the sentences get longer. Middle of summer, 60 days. And everybody, including the women themselves, find this kind of unbelievable that early on they're getting 3 days, now they're getting 60 days. The anger builds both on their part and on the part of the authorities, and the situation grows increasingly more tense.
And some of them were then sentenced to 6 and 7 months, particularly if they had been arrested in a protest previously.
The majority of them were jailed at the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia.
Occoquan was built at the turn of the century, a progressive era showplace for prisons. And it was meant to create an environment in which prisoners could be rehabilitated.
This workhouse was supposed to be a model jail,
Where the inmates made the bricks and planted the gardens and sewed their own uniforms, and it was a sort of work will make you free experiment.
In other words, you take the offender out of the inner city and all of the crime and so forth, and you take them to this lovely bucolic area and let them work with the farm animals and do that kind of menial task, but they're in this lovely setting. But that, of course, that's not what actually happened.
It also had a warden named Raymond Whitaker who had a real sadistic streak.
And he was just pure bad guy, like a cartoon evil villain.
So that what the women experienced was terrible food and very rough treatment. The food was a matter of huge concern, as you might imagine, because they got water, only water to drink. One of them once penned a prayer for coffee, please. Dry cornbread. The oatmeal would come with worms floating in it, and they made a game out of counting the worms. Rotten vegetables from this model farm.
The women were subjected to all kinds of indignities. And interestingly enough, in an era where the Wilson administration was reinstituting segregation in the federal bureaucracy and in the federal service, what they did was structure the situation so that they put the white women with the black prisoners. Today we think that's very racist, that the women were upset that they were housed with black women. But if you put yourself back in that time when that was a tremendous indignity, they also empowered some of the black women to beat with sticks some of the white women. So what they're doing is throwing racism into the mix as yet another layer of punishment. And of course, you don't know whether the black inmates wanted to do that or not, but their lives were on the line too. So you either capitulated or you paid a price.
So that was not a particularly pretty scene. So that was the treatment at that time.
And this whole, game of chicken with the judge is continuing.
We're in late summer, the sentences are growing longer, and Alice Paul goes out and joins the picket line. She would not, of course, ask people to do something she wouldn't do. They didn't want her her troops didn't want her on the picket line. They wanted her back in headquarters in Cameron House, running the show. So they asked Alice not to picket, but she was determined to do it. And she wanted to be on that picket line, and she was on that picket line, and she did get arrested. Now, she was sentenced to 7 months in jail as one of the leaders.
At one point, a psychiatrist is sent to Alice Paul to try to diagnose her as insane so she can be institutionalized.
They were trying to have her declared insane so that they could discredit her, her leadership of the movement itself.
Happily, the psychiatrist was honest and submitted one of my favorite quotes from the movement, which was, "Courage in women is often mistaken for insanity."
He did not go along with what the government actually wanted him to do. He said she was very determined, but very sane. He likened her to Joan of Arc, that she would not give up on her principles. You know, he had examined her backwards and forwards, and that she was perfectly sane, but very determined.
So even though she's in jail, her mind is still working, and she comes up with one last strategy. And this is that there will be the longest picket line ever. She thinks that picketing is actually getting a little long in the tooth. Winter is coming on, and probably it's a good idea to draw an end to the picketing strategy.
And the pickets are sort of outliving their usefulness at this point anyway. They're not getting as much press. They're starting to feel a little bit gimmicky. The National Women's Party knew when one tactic had outlived its usefulness and it was time to try something new. So they purposely intended to have some huge pickets that would get a lot of women arrested and would overflow the criminal justice system and force the men in charge to look at this issue and realize that this was insane, that this whole extended jail time for breaking no laws was in fact insane.
November 10th, 41 women are arrested.
They are by design from all around the country.
And that is the most ever. They're arrested, they bond themselves out. They go on trial on Tuesday, November 14th.
And they're sentenced to the district jail, but for reasons that are not totally clear, they're actually sent to Occoquan. And they all are put in a train down to Virginia. And when they get there, instead of the usual communal area, they are met by this evil warden, Whitaker, who screams that he's had enough. He's had enough of being nice to these women, serving them worm-ridden food. And he orders his guards to pick them up bodily and carry them into these steel punishment cells, which are individual, dark, foul, open toilet, freezing cold, cinder block cells. Just horrifying.
They are filthy. There is tobacco spit on the floors. There will later be testified that the linens are never changed between prisoners. The blankets are changed once a year. And there are vermin. There are rats, there are mice, there are flies, so you know something is dead in the building.
The women are hurled by the guards into these cinder block cells. They slam their heads. They fall to the ground. Mary Nolan, who was in her 70s and had one bad foot, was dragged. Dora Lewis was hurled so hard against the wall that she was knocked unconscious. One of her cellmates was convinced she was dead and promptly started vomiting and having a heart attack. The women are screaming. The guards are merciless.
And the warden storms up and down the corridor, and he's calling for straitjackets and gags and handcuffs.
Lucy Burns, in the dark, starts calling out the women's names to just call roll so that she can get an answer to find out if they're okay. The guards scream at her to stop calling the roll. She refuses to stop. They chain her with her arms over her head to the cell. She continues to call out the names in the dark. This is for standing on a street corner with a sign. This is all these women have done.
There was this feeling among the women that they might be personally attacked, that they might be raped even by these out-of-control guards. And the women were terrified for their lives.
Warden Whitaker and his jailers resented the feeling that they should be treating these women with kid gloves. And so they took off the gloves that one night, and it was almost as though Whitaker gave permission to everyone to just manhandle the women.
What happens then is that Mary Nolan, the oldest picket, is released after 6 days, and she goes back to headquarters and she's able to tell everyone about what happened.
She spreads the word about this night, which becomes known as the Night of Terror. And the details of the horror become more widespread.
The National Woman's Party response to the Night of Terror was absolute outrage, and to publicize it throughout the United States as much as possible. And they had a train called the Prison Special, where women who had been to the Lorton prison, had been jailed, dressed up in jail costumes and rented a train and went across the country, telling everybody in the various states they visited what was going on and how the women were being treated because they wanted to become full citizens and vote. And it was very effective, very clever and very effective.
The women who served longer sentences followed the British example that Emmeline Pankhurst had set and demanded political prisoner status. Political prisoner status should confer that you're able to wear your own clothes, that you're able to have writing equipment, reading things to read, an ability to communicate with the outside world. And if the women were refused political prisoner status, which they were routinely, they would go on hunger strikes. This had been a very effective tactic in England.
That was their sort of final defiant weapon, was the hunger strike. And then, of course, the guards and the prison officials retaliated with force feeding the women. They didn't want anybody to die on their watch. They knew that would be just horrible publicity. So they force fed the women, and that was an excruciating experience.
Force feeding is torture. Force feeding requires forcing a woman's mouth open. If she refuses to open her mouth, threading a tube down her nose. Often women's teeth were broken in the forcing open the mouth. The tube is shoved down your throat or down your nose. Through a funnel, liquid nutrition is poured in, and then the tube is ripped right out, often bloody. So force feeding is unendurable, horrifying. But that was the way that these wardens saw around the idea of having these frail women show up in court. It was, however, ultimately pretty effective. So the women who were sent to Occoquan that night of terror should have been sent to the district jail.
There are a couple of volunteer attorneys working for the National Women's Party, and they bring a suit against the Washington authorities based on habeas corpus because those Occoquan pickets were convicted in the District of Washington, and they should have gone to the district jail, and they win that in court. All the Occoquan prisoners are brought to testify in court, and the judge kind of throws up his hands. He looks out at this group. They are weak. They too have been force-fed because they've been on hunger strikes, and they're reclining on the benches. They can hardly sit up straight.
They were starving and frail, and several of them were really old, and it did not work for the Wilson administration whatsoever to have these terrible-looking women, in public in the court.
All of these prisoners are eventually set free.
And so the original strategy of sort of flooding the penal system with women and overwhelming it and making this issue have to come to a head really did work as planned.
The Wilson administration finally realized that this was a losing proposition and that they were getting more bad publicity than good publicity out of it. So everything was dropped. Just sort of summarily dropped. It was just a terrible situation, and it's hard for us, I think, to realize today that those kind of situations actually happened in this country because women wanted to vote.
finally, public opinion starts to turn back in favor of these women. That no matter how you feel about suffrage, no matter how obnoxious you thought those pickets might be, no matter how unwilling you are to see your president criticized in wartime, that the idea of beating and starving women for asking to participate in the democracy is not actually what America stands for.
Even if you disapproved of their picketing, and it's safe to say probably the majority of Americans did, you still recognized the courage it took to do what they were doing, and you knew furthermore they were not going to stop. If they could go through this kind of treatment and survive, their protests, their agitation was going to continue.
In the meantime, while all the protesting and going to prison was going on, in the states, there were these state referenda and suffrage campaigns, and enough of the states had passed women's suffrage that it changed the makeup of the National Congress.
More and more members who were supporting suffrage. It wasn't just Republicans, more Democrats were supporting suffrage, and it looked like 1918 might be the year. We're now about lobbying individual members, trying to make sure there's support for the federal amendment, continuing the state-by-state strategy, because the more states that pass suffrage, the more members are representing women now. And so it becomes much more of a legislative game. The president admits that suffrage might be okay, but doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't give a speech, he doesn't bend an ear, he doesn't strong-arm anybody. And the National Women's Party feels like he can't say he's pro-suffrage now and not actually use his bully pulpit to help the amendment at all. So they continue to find anti-Wilson protests, because he's continuing to fight for the end of World War I at this point and the whole peace strategy. And every time he gives a speech about democracy, they write down his words and set it on fire in a cauldron in front of the White House. And they give a bunch of rallies at the Lafayette statue in Lafayette Square and continue to put pressure on Wilson. But throughout 1918, it really looks like maybe all those tactics can stop. Maybe it can now be just a lobbying thing.
Finally, the bill goes before the Congress, and it has to pass the House and the Senate in the same year. So there was a lot of backing and forthing, and maybe the House would pass it or the Senate would pass it, but the other House would not.
But then it doesn't pass. In 1918, it fails. And the women think, now even if we get it through in 1919, we might not have the vote for the 1920 presidential election.
Alice is desperate to win ratification by the 1920 election. She is afraid that if women can't vote in that election, she's not going to be able to hold her party together. It takes a new Congress before both houses vote in favor of suffrage. And that's June of 1919. And they, at that point, voted with decisive margins.
So now it goes to the states. In 1919, there were 48 states, so 36 of them had to ratify to make it the law of the land. A bunch passed it immediately: Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois. A bunch voted down immediately, almost all in the South, and almost all for overtly racist reasons. Those states did not want to enfranchise a single new black voter. Finally, by the summer of 1920, 35 states have passed the 19th Amendment. Only one more is needed. 6 have voted it down, and 5 won't bring it to a vote. That leaves 2 states, North Carolina and Tennessee. The way the South has been going, neither of those look like a great option. North Carolina votes it down. Everyone shows up in Tennessee. All of the pro-suffrage people, all of the anti-suffrage people, the entire National Press Corps.
Everybody you can imagine descended on Tennessee. This was in August. It was hot, it was miserable, it was the South. So we had the anti-suffragist women there. We had the NASA women there, and Carrie Chapman Catt was actually there. We had the National Women's Party group that was there. They were lobbying.
and it comes the day of a vote, and there's a motion to table the amendment ratification, and the motion ties.
We're down to the last house of the last state, and it's a tie. A tie is a loss for suffrage. A tie means it goes down.
So there has to be a majority. So they start back down the roll call, and they get to the B's, and they come to the youngest legislator, whose name is Harry Byrne.
He was 24. No one expected him to change his mind. He wasn't on anyone's list. His mentor in the legislature was a very vocal anti-suffragist. He had voted no on the earlier vote. And his name begins with a B, so as the roll is called, this change of vote is sort of happens pretty early on. The whispers go out around the chamber. Did you just hear an aye vote from Harry Byrne? Did Harry Byrne just change his? Did you hear a yes from Harry Byrne? Who is Harry Byrne?
And the chamber just goes crazy. And the suffragists are singing and laughing and crying and embracing each other and embracing legislators.
The entire National Press Corps shows up at this guy's face. Little 24-year-old Harry Byrne. Mr. Byrne, why'd you change your vote? And it turns out his mama told him to. He had a letter in his breast pocket from his mother, Feb Byrne, that said, hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. And he said to the press corps, I really think it's best for a boy to, follow his mom's advice. And that's how arbitrary it was ultimately. It came down to one vote in the last house of the last legislature because Mrs. Byrne's letter got to Harry before the vote was cast.
And that one vote is what put us over the top and why we got the vote in August of 1920. One vote. So I tell everybody when I have the opportunity to talk about this that don't ever think that your vote doesn't count, because it was one vote that got women, all the women in the United States, the opportunity to vote.
The women who have been fighting for this through parties everywhere. Alice Paul had been making a flag where every time a new state ratified, she sewed another star onto it. She finally was able to sew the 36th star onto the flag and draped it out over the balcony of the National Women's Party headquarters on Lafayette Square.
And when that amendment finally did pass, and women could look back on that record of what had been accomplished, it gave women pride, it gave them dignity, and it gave them power. I think this was the biggest societal change in America that has ever taken place, because it touched on the lives of half of the American population, fully half. And nothing, not immigration, not civil rights, has ever made that kind of change.
Because of getting suffrage, that opened the door for women to become business owners, for women to get advanced education, for women to be able to join the military. If women didn't have suffrage and didn't have the opportunity to vote, a lot of the progress for women that we have now would never have happened.
Once the 19th Amendment passed, Alice Paul decided that was the beginning, not the end. That with women as full citizens, they now could turn towards other ways that they were not equal in the eyes of the law.
She was never after only the vote for women. The vote was just a means to an end, and the end is equal rights for women. And so she writes the Equal Rights Amendment.
She never got to see the Equal Rights Amendment passed. It still hasn't passed. That is sort of unfinished business of the National Women's Party.
I think I speak for all American women to get the vote for women. In asking you to make our victory complete, so not only be a country with the right to vote for women, we be a country in which there's complete equality under the law.
That I am here tonight is a testament to the dedication of generations before me. These women and the generations that followed worked to make democracy and opportunity real in the lives of all of us who followed. And these women inspired us to pick up the torch and fight on.
Do I think women are equal yet?
In the eyes of the law, no, I don't think so.
No, of course we're not equal.
I would have to say no. We've certainly come a long way, to use that phrase. But I think people still have to stop and think about it.
There are a lot of measures, laws that give women equality, equality in employment and in various other respects. These are laws, and they can be countered or repealed. Court decisions, the same thing. And so the only real protection is an amendment, and that, of course, is the Equal Rights Amendment. We need a constitutional guarantee.
I think all of the women who fought for the 19th Amendment would find a cause to be active in now. I think they would each find a role to play and a cause to fight for.
I don't know what advice I would give to women today, except to say remain vigilant so that the rights that were so hard won by previous generations are not rescinded, not taken away. And I think that's an ongoing vigilance. So I think we have to remain vigilant and active and willing to go out and fight again, if necessary.
tired of fighting again and again those powers that seek to disenfranchise citizens of these United States. But as radical reformer Lucretia Mott once said,
any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege.
we are here and awake to the reality that the right to vote remains as fragile as it is fundamental, and that the vote is a fundamental right of citizenship. We are still here and still alive and singing and commemorating and celebrating those radical reformers who led the way to
stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women.
Susan B. Anthony.
Forget what the world thinks of you stepping out of your place. Think your best thoughts. Speak your best words. Work your best works. Looking to your own conscience for approval.
Did I not feel that the time had come for the questions of women's wrongs to be laid before the public? Did I not believe that woman herself must do this work? For women alone understand the height, depth, the breadth of her degradation.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke these words in her address to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, a groundbreaking gathering of progressive men and women who met to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of woman. Stanton was instrumental in drafting the convention's Declaration of Sentiments, with resolutions fashioned after the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Those facts laid out in the sentiments describe gross inequalities in women's education, property rights, employment, religion, and in marriage. Upon marrying, a woman merged with her husband and became civilly dead. She had no rights of custody over her own children.
He has endeavored in every way he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life.
Over 2 days, the sentiments and resolutions were debated, especially
resolved that it is the duty of the woman of this country to secure to themselves their sacred rights to the elective franchise.
Stanton's insistence on including a resolution demanding the vote was thought too radical by most of those assembled, including Lucretia Mott.
Lizzie, they will make us ridiculous.
It met great opposition, but with the support of Stanton's friend, the esteemed Frederick Douglass, the demand for suffrage passed. The torch had been lit, a movement begun. Over the following decade, national and regional women's rights conventions were held annually. The circle of women engaged in the debate widened steadily. At the center were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the new movement's philosopher, Lucretia Mott, its moral force, Lucy Stone, its voice, and Susan Anthony, its organizer.
Our religion, laws, customs are all founded on the belief that women was made for man.
The world has never yet seen a truly great and virtuous nation, because in the degradation of woman, the very fountains of life are poisoned at their source.
In education, in marriage, in religion, in everything. Disappointment is the lot of woman. It shall be the business of my life to deepen this disappointment in every woman's heart until she bows down to it no longer.
Organize, agitate, educate must be our war cry.
Stanton and Anthony's relationship, begun in 1851 and lasting over a half-century, was to become one of the most consequential partnerships in American history. They were collaborators and co-conspirators, confidants and critics, clashing sisters. Stanton was thought and Anthony action.
I forged the thunderbolts and she fired them.
Like Mott and Anthony, many of the early advocates for women's rights drew upon their Quaker values upholding gender equality. All of the early advocates for women's rights were also ardent abolitionists. The two causes sprang from the same seeds of moral reform.
Let woman then go on, not asking favors, but claiming as a right the removal of all hindrances to her elevation in the scale of being.
We ask justice, we ask equality, we ask that all civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us, our daughters, forever.
We take our stand on the solidarity of humanity, the oneness of life, and the injustice of all special favoritism, whether of sex, race, country, or condition. If one link of the chain is broken, the chain is broken.
Respect ourselves.
those who will turn the scale to the side of equal and full justice in all things.
Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less.
At the first National Women's Rights Convention after the Civil War, suffrage was a hot topic. A 15th Amendment to the Constitution had been proposed in Congress, establishing voting rights of black male citizens. Stanton and Anthony had lobbied mightily to get the 15th to also outlaw discrimination in voting based on sex as well as race. They were outraged that women had been shut out of the franchise at this opportune moment. Stanton lashed out with virulent, racist language, decrying the black man as unqualified and illiterate. For many years, she had agitated mightily for emancipation. Now, truly, she felt it was the woman's turn for freedom. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a prominent African-American abolitionist, poet, and suffragist, rose to speak.
We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul.
Harper would have none of the equivalencies being made between women's status and slavery.
You white women here speak of rights, I speak of wrongs. This grand and glorious revolution which has commenced will fail to reach its climax of success until the length and breadth of the American Republic, the nation shall be so colorblind as to know no man by the color of his skin or the curl of his hair. It will then have no privileged class, trampling upon and outraging the unprivileged classes, but will then be one great privileged nation, whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain.
We are all bound up together. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. 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 We are all bound up together. 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 We are all bound up together.
And yet the 15th Amendment divided the movement. While many continued to support its passage and the goal of universal suffrage, Stanton and Anthony became determined in their belief that women needed their own constitutional amendment.
The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
A white woman has only one handicap to overcome, that of sex. I have two, both sex and race. Colored men have only one, that of race. Colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as that of sex.
Yet despite the blatant racism and class bias of the women's suffrage movement, Black women discouraged and betrayed continued to work for their right to vote, both as Blacks and as women, through their own suffrage organizations. Until recently, the story of Black women suffragists had not been told. While they were important figures from the beginning, as the 19th century came to a close, a legion of Black women from both North and South formed women's clubs dedicated to educational uplift and social justice. Led by women such as Mary Church Terrell, more and more Black women joined the cause of women's suffrage.
And so, lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst forth into glorious fruition ere long. With courage born of success achieved in the past, with a keen sense of responsibility for which we shall continue to assume, we look forward to a future large with promise and hope. Seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs. We knock at the bar of justice, asking an equal chance.
Sadly, many white suffragists working for the cause did not extend an equal chance to their African American sisters. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA, with Anthony at its helm, employed Southern strategy to appease the segregationists, as it was widely believed that gaining women's suffrage would be impossible without their support. The seeds of distrust planted in this era echoed the strained relationship between white feminists and Black women in the women's rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, and to this present day.
Between the Civil War and the final passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, 2 more generations of women's rights activists had taken on the fight. Again, there were divisions, this time over strategy. Alice Paul, young, fearless, willing to use new militant tactics, split from the NWSA and formed the National Women's Party. From parades to picketing the White House to prison time, the NWP gained maximum national publicity to the movement.
Carrie Chapman Catt, to whom Susan B. Anthony passed the torch, was every bit the organizer as Anthony, but was wary of radical tactics. She believed in a more diplomatic approach. Ultimately, Alice Paul and Carrie Catt, militancy and diplomacy, both carried the 19th Amendment through to its passage in Congress in 1919. In a dramatic political finale, Tennessee became the required 36th state to ratify it, and on August 18, 1920, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment became the law of the land.
While we rightly celebrate the bold and selfless efforts of the generations of women of all races and backgrounds who fought valiantly for the vote, let us also remember that the 19th Amendment is inherently intertwined with the 15th Amendment and the ongoing struggle for voting rights.
In the decades following the passage of women's suffrage, just as Jim Crow laws and violent threats had kept Black men from exercising their 15th Amendment rights, Black women were routinely turned away from the ballot box. Not until decades later, with passage and renewal of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, were the tools of disenfranchisement finally outlawed. The VRA's mandated federal oversight ensured that state and local governments could not pass laws or policies that deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on race.
On June 25, 2013, the Supreme court swept away a key provision of this landmark civil rights law in Shelby County versus Holder. We continue to see how that decision has led to a tremendous resurgence in voter suppression laws across the nation. What better way to honor the suffrage centennial than to address the ways in which citizens continue to be disenfranchised by voter suppression measures that function much like those a century ago.
Voter ID laws.
Closure of polling places forcing long lines.
Misinformation campaigns.
Increased restrictions on early voting.
Purging of voter rolls.
Voting rights are under attack in America. There is a deliberate and systematic attempt to prevent millions of elderly voters, young voters, students, minority, and low-income voters from exercising their constitutional right to engage in the democratic process. John Lewis.
Tonight, we are here and awake. We praise and we protest. And so let us also celebrate and support today's reformers and activists. As Dolores Huerta once said,
every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person a political activist. Every minute a chance to change the world.
Cease the flame.
This is the next battle for our democracy, one where all eligible citizens can have their say about the vision we want for our country. Stacey Abrams.
Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it with every generation. Coretta Scott King.
Any great change must expect opposition because it shakes the very foundation of privilege.
All we need is to continue to speak the truth fearlessly, and we shall add to our number those who will turn the scale to the side of equal and full justice in all things.
The way to right the wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. Ida B. Wells.
Truth is the only safe ground to stand upon.
Failure is impossible.
Life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me. Sojourner Truth.
Every one of us.
Wasn't that magnificent? Wow. Thank you, Candelina, Women's Voices, and Voices Rising. So this is the exciting part of the evening, or it just continues, because we're going to have our audience talk back now before the cookies. So I would just like to mention how much has been happening in Massachusetts. This is part of Arlington 250 and Massachusetts 250, with the focus of telling women's untold stories. And this magnificent performance of Lifting as We Climb has been part of that. So we are most grateful to all of the collaborators and organizations that helped make this possible. And I've had a couple of other groups. Oh, and I wanted to mention, the League of Women Voters was founded in 1920 as soon as we got the vote under the direction of Carrie Chapman Catt, so that all of these issues that are all women's issues can get carried forward. Educate, agitate, organize. Yeah, that's it. So here is my question for you. And I want to mention also, before we get into that, we will have 2 mic runners, so don't try to speak until the mic has gotten to you. And I wanted to just mention that if you speak and you don't want to be recorded, come see me and we'll make sure that that part doesn't get included in the recording. So having unflinching activism to gain the vote. Today we are immersed in multiple attacks threatening our right to vote, expanding disenfranchisement to many citizens. Here's the question. How can this history of struggle and achievement guide us now to protect our hard-won rights? So those are the questions that I have to offer to you. And we have our mic runners ready to connect with you. And I would just invite you to raise your hand if you're ready to share a reflection. Here we have the founder of this wonderful organization of the Massachusetts Women's History Center. And by the way, the Massachusetts Women Hall of Fame is opening nominations for living and deceased women and our organizations in Massachusetts, creating our own Hall of Fame. So please, start us off.
Thank you. I would say, in terms of what we can do and how this can inspire us, we know that there are many efforts going on. It's complicated in some ways because there are lawsuits happening, thank goodness, around the country, etc. For us, I think of the women who fought for over 72 years. And it was quoted in the show just now, failure is impossible. And I think of the last song in the Suffrage musical that's left Broadway. It's coming to Boston in a year. And the last song in that show is Keep Marching. And I think it says it all. I think it says it all. Thank you.
Thank you. So you know that this is not a Q&A. I don't have the answers. So this is your opportunity to share your reflections. We have a voice coming in the back. Can you stand up when you speak? Thanks. As able.
I think it's really important that we remember that, we have the power to make change, and we as the people have the power to do that. And I think that that's really important because, as you've seen, in the documentaries, and throughout history, we have the ability to push the boundaries of what is societally acceptable and what we have the power to do. And I think that that's really powerful and really important, especially with current politics and all of the discrimination that is in the world. And I think that that's really important to remember.
Thank you. You kind of
have to eat the mic.
Okay, got it. I think another important part is the way that all of these women thought their entire lives, never truly seeing the extent of all the change they made. So I think for me, the only way that I feel like I can pay them back for all the change they did is to follow them and give that same change to the future.
You're doing it.
Big row, we like to talk over here.
Good, all right.
I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the actual physical sacrifices that were made. It wasn't just about protesting in the cold and the rain. Women were beaten and tortured. And I think that as we face this moment that we're currently in, we also have to look at what are we willing to do with our bodies. And protesting and marching is important. But what else can we do? And what else is going to be asked of us? And what is each of us, we all need to look inside ourselves and wonder, what are we willing to do for the future, right? For the future generations that have not been born yet. So that my takeaway was like really asking myself, what am I willing to do beyond, that's uncomfortable, that's, beyond the marching, beyond the protesting.
I enjoyed very much. I admire with this show. And one thing that I learned is the division that was among women by race. And if we want to go forward, we need to educate ourselves. We need to love ourselves and unite. Because if we divide among ourselves, imagine what happened with men and the rest. So.
Thank you.
I have two things to say. The first one is I am very concerned about what this administration is doing, and I think we are only seeing the beginning of it. And I think disenfranchisement and separating people and causing fear, it's going to get much worse. And I think we do need to think about what we're willing to put on the line. We're mostly white, Anglo-Saxon, middle-class Americans who aren't under threat now. But I really worry about the future, and I think it's going to be bleak. Secondly, there's a movement in Massachusetts that just came up at my select board meeting in Westford, Massachusetts this week to enfranchise green card holders. And I think that our Constitution is changing, who America is made up has changed. And these people pay taxes, and some of them own property, and their children go to our schools. And it's a different way of thinking about who is enfranchised. There are about 6 towns that have already passed this by town meeting, but the state has done nothing to comment or to accept the home rule. So I just want to put that seed out there that there are immigrants here who are already part and fabric of our community, and the path to citizenship after a green card can be very long. So, but I'm mostly really worried about this administration, and I don't think marching is going to be enough. I think we have to do what the suffragettes did and embarrass the hell out of the people who are lying and not obeying the law.
So a little aside there, that in Great Britain, it was suffragettes, and in this country, mostly known as suffragists. So one of those little tidbits. But Massachusetts has been very active right from the way before even this started, with Abigail Adams telling John Adams,
Don't forget the ladies.
That's right.
Remember the ladies, yes, don't forget the ladies. So, and we've gone through, even here in Arlington, the Arlington Advocate was officially opposed to suffrage for women. And the comment, no wonder they're gone. One of the cartoons that was shown in the film was from Blanche Ames, who lived here in Massachusetts, and her grandson, Oakes Plimpton here, made sure to publish her cartoons. And she would ring the bell every day in her house. She had a hole dug into the side of her house so she could do it every day that women didn't get the vote. So it was, and yet her cousin was leading the anti-suffrage. So all in, right here in our town and state, the battle has continued. And I just learned that Alice Paul protested Wilson right here and was among the last to be arrested for this in the Charles Street jail, where I was jailed there too. I didn't get force-fed. But the history right here is amazing with all of this work. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Am I on? There we go. Hi. To lead off of that, to extend, the Massachusetts Women's History Center is built on 14 years of being Suffrage 100 MA. We're a statewide nonprofit focused on the suffrage movement, and when the pandemic arrived in 2020, we had reserved the Boston Common for a huge parade and had to cancel it because of the pandemic. So I think you could say we made lemonade out of lemons, and we created a 30-minute film that is online and includes the Massachusetts story. And the Massachusetts story is amazing. In this movie that we just saw, there were many Massachusetts women marching in the 1913 parade, many who went to jail, and some of whom were among those who were jailed in Boston in 1919 when Woodrow Wilson came to Massachusetts to avoid the suffragists in New York. He came up to Boston, and Alice Paul met his boat. She was actually not arrested. They didn't want her to, no, she was not arrested, but she organized the group that protested in front of the State House. They were arrested, and they were the last women in the country jailed for the vote. I'm pleased that in Massachusetts they did not force feed them, but they were arrested. So downstairs as you go, we have some cards that are available with a QR code to see the film. It's on our website, mawomenshistory.org, where there's a lot of history. Blanche Ames, we have material about her biographies and so forth. So I encourage you to check that out. Thank you so much.
So any other wonderful comments that we have to make? Oh. Well, it can be just a really good comment.
I'll just say really quickly, thank you so much for this incredible show in every way. One thought I had, I had two, I'm just going to share two things. One, it struck me that around this time period of the building up to the, women's votes, was the Spanish flu pandemic. So that just seems like, I wonder how that all played into those years. Because my grandma was 20 when women got the vote, and I just wonder, because I think she was in Minnesota, but I think she would have been doing something related to the rights for women. But also, I want to say just the creativity of this show and the history telling and the beauty of the music, and also the artistic, weaving of the dialogue and the, quoting and everything was just powerful to me, very powerful. And I hope we all can continue to do more of that for all of the causes of equality and justice, because it just gives you hope while all of the challenges. So, thank you so much, so great.
Yes.
I have one quick comment, and for me, it came out of the film, and it radiates through my whole consciousness. One vote.
Yes.
That's all it took. That's a tremendous, and he changed it.
Yeah.
You gotta put that in your back pocket and keep working for the vote for everybody in England.
Bless his mother. Well, thank you all so much. I don't want to cut anyone off if you're ready, but those cookies and the fruit, they're kind of calling me. So I want to thank you all so much on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Arlington, Catalina Women's Voices, Arlington Friends of the Drama, Arlington Community Media, Inc. We are all most grateful to you and our friends at Voices Rising who filled the stage. It's been a wonderful opportunity to connect with you all. Let's go eat something.
ACMi productions are only made possible with your support. Visit patreon.com/ACMi to learn how you can help.